Hello, everyone. It's Will Rycroft here. It's one of my favorite days of the year. This is where we get a chance to meet the six authors who have been shortlisted for the Waterstones Debut Fiction Prize. This is a prize which exists because of our booksellers and their voracious reading. They are absolutely brilliant at spotting new talent. They read a lot, they have opinions, and they share them. And over the last few months, they have been reading voraciously, and they have whittled those down to six authors who they are very, very excited about. And we're going to meet them all now. And in fact, they're all meeting each other for the first time right now as well, which is why I love today because it's always very exciting. You're not going to want to listen to me wittering on. So I'm going to actually ask these authors to introduce themselves and their books. And in a very fair booksellery type way, I've actually just put my stack of books into alphabetical order, which of course, Catherine means I'm going to be coming to you first.
Hi, I'm Catherine Airey, and my novel is called Confessions. It's quite a sweeping family drama, and it opens on the day of 9/11 with 16-year-old Cora Brady. It then goes back in time to 1970s Ireland, and different members of the same family all tell different parts of the same story. So there's a lot of like intergenerational trauma and different connections to make between different times and places.
Fantastic. Very well done, Catherine. I know it's very unfair of me to ask all of you to distill years of hard work into a pithy sentence or two, but you've done that very nicely. Next on my list is Gurnaik. I'm coming to you. Please introduce yourself and your novel.
Hi, yeah, I'm Gurnaik Johal, and my novel is Saraswati. It's the story of a sort of ancient holy river being brought back to life in modern day India, and the sort of crosses climate crisis and Hindu nationalism. But at its heart, it's the story of a sort of family coming together across various diasporas.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gurnaik. Next on my list is Niamh. Please introduce yourself and your book.
Yes, hello. It's lovely to be here with you all. My name is Niamh Mhaoileoin. My book is Ordinary Saints, and it tells the story of Jay, who is a queer Irish woman living in London. She has quite an independent life. She doesn't really think a lot about her past or speak very much to her parents. In particular, she kind of ignores the death of her brother Ferdia when she was 16 and he was 24. But then at the very beginning of the novel, she gets a call from her parents informing her that Ferdia is in the process of being made a Catholic saint. And then these kind of careful divides that Jay has established in her life start to break down, and she has to kind of face up to her grief, to her family, and really have a big old think about her past and who she wants to be.
Fantastic. Thank you, Niamh. Next on my pile is William. William, please introduce yourself and your novel.
Hello, hi. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to meet you all. My name is William Rayfet Hunter, and my novel is called Sunstruck. It is a story about love and power and trying to change yourself in order to be loved. It's set on a holiday in a glamorous, grand villa in the south of France, where our narrator, who's a mixed race man from the north of England, goes and falls in love with the Blake family and their whole way of life. It's in some ways a parable about forgetting who you are and trying to rediscover it. And yeah, it's about the messy parts of love and what happens when we try to hide.
Fantastic. Thank you, William. Lisa, I'm coming to you next. Please introduce yourself and your book.
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Ridzén, and my book is When the Cranes Fly South. And it's about an old man and the last time of his life. It sets place in rural northern Sweden. And it's basically, yeah, it's a story about an old man dying. It sounds so maybe not very thrilling, but yeah, so he contemplates about his life and he tries to solve the problems with his son.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. And rounding off our shortlist is Lucy. Lucy, please introduce yourself and your novel.
Hi, I'm Lucy Steeds, and I'm the author of The Artist. The Artist is set in 1920 in the south of France, and it begins with this person called Joseph walking down a path towards a house that he's been invited to. But when he arrives at the house, which is the home of this very famous reclusive painter, Tartuffe, he discovers he's actually not been invited at all. Something has gone afoot, and thus begins this very hot, sticky summer where he stays with this artist in his house, trying to uncover what is actually going on. And there is one other person living in this house who is the painter's niece, Etty, and she moves very silently throughout this house. And as the temperature increases over the sticky summer, these three people are circling each other within this one house, and all of them have secrets. So it's this claustrophobic story about art and creation in the wake of destruction, and just these three people peeling each other's secrets away layer by layer.
Six completely different books. Already a sense there of the amazing places that you can be taken by fiction and some of the themes that come up. Um, Marshalling a conversation about six very different books can be a tricky thing, but I'm going to try and take inspiration from one of those books, Gurnaik's Saraswati, which of course is about a river. And of course, any river has its tributaries. And I'm hoping that we will find through this conversation that despite the fact there are all these different tributaries, they do all come together. And we will find that our booksellers have found, some themes that might cross and combine some of these books, but they've all found something that they love in them. And in fact, Gurnaik, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you because of that, because so many of our booksellers were impressed by, I suppose, the multi-stranded narrative that you're sort of pulling together with your book. Emma in Blue Water said that they liked the interwovenness of the stories as the book moved on. And Maliki in Chiswick said that the lives of each character felt so rich and realized the links between them all beautifully brought together at the end. Now, that is, of course, a lovely thing to hear, but on your part, presumably a huge amount of work. How do you approach writing a novel which has so many strands that you need to tie together?
Yeah, it's definitely difficult. I wouldn't recommend it. If I could do it over again, I might tell a simpler story. But in a sense, because it's told in seven distinct sections following seven different characters, it was almost useful because if I was stuck on one section, I could kind of move to the other and sort of have an idea of where in the story I would be. And I felt like because I was sort of writing into each bucket at the same time, it allowed me to bring all those, like you said, the interwovenness of it together. So yeah, I think it sort of came organically, but and I feel like for the reader, I want it to feel like the characters start to feel more and more connected as the book goes along, and that's how it felt for me as a writer. So there was kind of maybe parallel there.
What one other bookseller had mentioned that they would, because you say there's different sections, but they're sort of connected by families. They kept flicking back to the beginning of the book to sort of see which family they were, and it reminded me of when I finally tackled War and Peace. The edition
Oh,
I
right.
came with a bookmark that had the families put together on it, and it was just revel. It was so made it so much easier to read because you were like, oh, I see. And of course, they've all got three different names because it's
I
right.
think that's the crazy thing about that book is if they all had one single name, I
Yeah.
think I could do it. But it's the fact that they've got like, yeah. But everyone in my book has, yeah, one stable name throughout the whole thing.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Catherine, I'm going to come to you next because, as you gave sort of a hint in your introduction, your book as well has narratives from different characters and time periods and things like that. And Jem in Ipswich said that the author, sorry, I'm going to call you the author, but that your attention to the motifs and the objects that appeared in between each narrator, and there was these changes in tense or writing style they thought was absolutely brilliant. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about some of those literary techniques that you used to sort of make things clear in your novel about who we were with and when.
Yeah, I had a bit of a similar experience where, because I hadn't written a novel before, I was getting quite stuck with like a single perspective and doing that thing where then I'd be like, oh, well, what had happened in their past or in their childhood that might have, to sort of distinguish the characters. And there are quite a few sort of found objects in the book. So there's a section of the book that's told through letters. There's a section that's told through diary entries. And actually, just before I started writing, I'd found some old letters that were from my granddad to my grandma when they just got engaged and she was going back to Ireland to tell her family that she was marrying a Protestant. So she'd gone on her own to break the news. So I just had one half of these letters, so that only his side of the story. We didn't have her replies. So yeah, I think I was quite fascinated by the idea that these different kind of artifacts could tell part of a story without giving away everything that was going on. So they were all sort of quite unreliable narrators in a way that are told in a slightly different way.
Writing character is a trickier thing, I think, than a lot of readers appreciate. Keeping characters really distinct and separate from each other, really fully fleshed, and all the rest of it. And so many of our booksellers were saying this about the books that you've all written. William, I'm going to come to you because I think one of my favourite bookseller comments came from Bex in Oxford, who said that they loved that you could understand how each character had become who they are and why they do such awful things and still hate them for it anyway, which I think is so funny. Tell us a little bit about creating characters, the characters in Sunstruck, and I suppose without wanting to sort of say, unlikable characters, but pe fully realize people that you can still absolutely abhor.
Yeah, I love that. That feels like I've done my job, which is so nice. I've written a book about power and about white supremacy and about dating dynamics within that, about the haves and the have-nots. And I was really, really wary of making it sound like this moralistic tale of like these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in people and why they do what they do. And the people in the novel wield these huge powers against each other in potentially disastrous ways. The listeners would have to read it to find out. But I wanted people to explain themselves. So I wanted to give hints to their upbringing or to what they'd been through to get to where they were in order to justify their behavior to themselves. I don't think anyone is inherently evil. I think people do evil things, or I don't think anyone in the book is actually evil, but people do bad things to each other and they hurt each other because they've been hurt or because their worldview is kind of predicated on their experiences. So I think when I was writing it, I really sat with the characters and I wanted to look around and be like, well, why? Why would this person do this thing that seems actually kind of horrid and is horrid in the context just of the moment? But actually, if you zoom out and see where they're coming from, you know that they think they're doing something that's actually not that bad.
Mm.
I like unlikable characters. I think it makes it a more interesting read. And with the narrator, even you get a lot of his backstory through flashbacks, and he's not the sort of worst character morally in the book, but he doesn't keep his hands clean, and he there's some betrayals and some sort of very questionable acts that he does. And I wanted to show why a person who has been victimized might also use what they can in order to kind of shore themselves up, and how that can have pretty uncomfortable effects for the people in his life.
Mm. That's really, really fascinating. Lisa, I'm going to come to you now. When you were introducing your book, you mentioned that you're sort of seeing it from the perspective of a much older man. And in fact, one of our booksellers in Harpenden has said that what they loved about the book was that it was a really beautifully nuanced exploration of very, late old age and the misunderstandings that can arise in a family after all that time. Can you tell us a little bit about writing a much older character? Because obviously you are not in the late bloom of life. You're a young person. How do you approach that?
I'm obviously not an old man.
No, can
Um,
confirm. Yeah.
I think that like I've been slightly obsessed with men and masculinity my whole life. And I do research about men and masculinity as well. So it was very natural for me to write from a male perspective. And the reason why I wanted to focus on an old man's perspective was that there's something very interesting with aging and masculinity because it kind of forces men into vulnerability. And vulnerability is not, it's not like very common to take part of vulnerable stories from, especially not men living in the rural far north of Sweden.
Mm,
So I think that that was kind of something that sparked why it became an older man. But I've also worked in the elderly care, and I had a very close relationship to my grandfather. So I feel quite close to old men. I feel like an old man in many ways.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We've been talking a little bit there about character, and sometimes character can be something different to a person. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that as I come to you, Niamh, because so many booksellers pointed out about how one of the themes in your book was so strong that it sort of felt like another character, if you like, in the book. LMA in Lewis said that they stopped multiple times whilst they were reading your book to ponder how you so aptly portray grief and its ever lingering presence. And it's something obviously that sits in the book. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's a hard thing to write about without sort of dragging stuff down and to make it actually live in the book like a character. Tell us about grief.
Yeah, well, that's it's a lovely reflection. So thanks to LMA. Yeah, really, there's a character in this book who's Jay's brother Ferdia, who is never physically present in the book. He's been dead for 13 years. But the book entirely circles around him because it's this kind of struggle over his memory is really a defining characteristic of the book. And there's the Catholic Church is kind of trying to do one thing with his memory and hold him up as this literal saintly character. The parents are kind of super invested in this process. But then Jay is like, this guy was just my brother and I miss him. And I feel like everyone is trying to take him from me and take that memory from me. And so it was for me one of the big challenges of writing the book was uh, trying at once to keep him as this kind of unknowable presence in the book and to create this feeling that we can never, neither Jay nor the reader can get the answers that they want about Verdia because he's gone. But I also thought that he really needed to be present and feel lovable and and this because his saintliness is so central that had to you had to get some kind of sense that he is special. And so one of the ways I did that was through early in the book, there's quite a lot of flashback. It really operates on a dual timeline. But then as the book progresses, there's less and less of the flashback. And so uh, we essentially kind of start to lose Verdia as an active presence in the book. And part of what I was trying to do was to force the reader to feel the same kind of sadness and loss at him not being present as his family feel.
It clearly worked for LMA, who may well still be recovering from reading the book. And just to finish off with you, Lucy, sometimes character isn't character at all. It's place, and a sense of place is so strong that it has a big impact on readers. And Jess in Blue Water said that when they were reading The Artist, they were so heavily transported into the hazy French countryside that I was actually surprised when I remembered I was holding a book and sitting in my bedroom, which is a fantastic thing to hear about your writing. Conjuring place without simply describing, where the setting of somewhere is really tricky again, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about how you set about writing that sense of the south of France and I suppose that period as well?
That's such a beautiful comment. Thank you. It was a very fun place to conjure. Firstly, I was very conscious that in writing a book about art, the visual would be really heavily present in the book. And I didn't want to neglect the other senses. I didn't want vision to only be the sense that we dig into. So I was really conscious from the beginning that I wanted to dig my fingers into every possible sense, which is why everything's really sticky or dry and dusty, or there are all these really overpowering scents and tastes. There's a huge amount of taste in the book as well. And just these overpowering sounds of the crickets rustling. It's really relentless. So I wanted to almost overwhelm the senses to create this place. And it builds throughout the novel. So one switch I wanted to create was that when you, the reader, arrive in this remote farmhouse, you arrive with Joseph and you're very wide-eyed, and it's lovely because you're in the south of France in the summer, which is beautiful, and you know it from paintings, and it's visually sumptuous and everything is lovely. And then as the book progresses, I wanted this full turning where the summer heat increases, the food bursts open and rots, and it all becomes too oppressive. And the claustrophobia of this house is mimicked in the landscape, where by the end of the book, hopefully as a reader, you almost want to like Joseph peel himself out of this house, which started off as an Eden and became a prison by the end.
Very nice. Fantastic. Actually going to stick with you, Lucy, because it's really interesting that you mentioned about the fact that the book is about art in many ways. And one of our booksellers, Ian in Weybridge, had said that some of the best descriptions of art and creativity that he's ever read in a novel are in The Artist. You're all artists, of course, but you're working in a writing medium. And I wondered how you approached writing about something completely different, the visual arts. And I suppose what things might be the same when it comes to the act of creation, in this sense. How do you sit down and write about creativity without it feeling like a lecture?
Um, with daily headaches and frustration, which I hope doesn't come across in the book. But no, it's a really interesting one. I was very aware that when I was translating a visual medium into writing, something was gonna have to change. Something was happening there. And I am a really visual reader and I'm a very visual writer. And I'm really aware that not everyone is.
Hmm.
So one of my main aims in this book was to write a book about art that was never annoying. Because I was like, it's going to be so easy for a book about art to be annoying or frustrating if you can't visualize this stuff that I'm talking about. So I had to find a way of using language to describe art and the visual without frustrating the reader. And that was a really active decision. So what I used to do is I would just go to art galleries, sit in front of a painting, and let it wash over me. I would sit in front of one painting for an hour and just absorb it because I really quickly realized that if you're trying to describe a painting, it is virtually useless to describe it anatomically. So if I say there's like a little bit of red in the top and then there's some blue beneath that, as a reader, you're going to skip those pages. And I never wanted a reader to skip any page in this book. So I had to find another way of writing about painting, which was never anatomical or clinical. And I did that through just flooding the senses again and going in through the emotions and making these paintings come alive rather than analyzing them as cold objects. So the fact that, yeah, people can visualize them, even when readers who are not necessarily visual readers, people have said to me that they can picture every single detail of the paintings, which is so gratifying because I made them all up, which was another challenge because it's one thing to describe a painting that exists in words, but I was like holding imaginary paintings I had invented in my head, describing them in words, and then somehow other people can see them. And that for me is when language is just alive. And I love that so much.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Um, Niamh, I'm going to come to you now with the very tiny topic of religion. Obviously, your book deals with it, and more importantly, it deals with it with consideration. Um, but they had a bookseller called Bella, and they said that they thought that there was a lot of consideration and care for both sides. So both the church and the main character, and the conflict of her growing up, and the happier memories of her brother compared to the unforgivable attitudes that the church now has, and thought it was done really sensitively. Tell me a little bit about how you approach writing about something so charged.
Yes, it was a challenge and it was something that I definitely felt a lot of anxiety about the entire time. I still do. And so it's really lovely to hear from Bella that it felt like I walked that tightrope because I think an absolute priority of mine was that I did not want to go easy on the Catholic Church. I'm very angry about the legacy of the Catholic Church, particularly in Ireland, but also around the world. But I think what I was really interested in this book is how religion operates in families and in communities, and particularly having grown up in Ireland in the period I did, we saw this massive social transformation and this collapse in religious faith and in devotion to the Catholic Church. And to me, this is a really interesting question that we don't actually, I think, talk about that much. Is that like if you've got parents who are still super religious and children who are atheists, that is such a huge divide in a family. And that's the different people in that family have a fundamentally different understanding of how the universe is constituted, of how we should live good and moral lives. Um, and I think initially I started out uh, with a lot more of my own views, and I took a side a lot more in the early drafts. But then as I got to know all of these characters more, and particularly Ferdia's faith and the parents' faith began to be a real thing to me, and I understood that as kind of a pervasive presence in their lives. Um, it kind of became less about the institution and much more just about how all of us are kind of doing our best and trying to pursue lives that have meaning. And so I tried to give everyone as fair a hearing as I could,
Mm.
while also recognizing kind of their flaws and the times they get it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, with something like that, do you, as you said, in early drafts where presumably you're working in isolation, so that it's just you on your own, um, is it, were you using other readers, for example, or getting other people's points of view to help achieve that balance, or was it just more about you still in your zone, on your own, going through it again and making sure that that balance was there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very cagey with my early drafts, and I'm quite superstitious. So in the early stages, it was mostly me, but it was really just me getting to know my characters,
Yeah.
um, and that, yeah, and kind of, I'm putting later in the book, the characters start to come into dialogue with each other more, and they brought me on a journey really. But then when I did start to like share it with people and move more into the editing process, I started getting feedback where people were like, "Oh, actually, I love the character of the mother," and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." Like there was some part of me that was still like, "She's quite a bad mother, objectively," um, but then yeah, getting that feedback meant that I could dig in a bit more and be like, "Oh, what is it about her that's resonating with people? How can I draw that out even more and kind of balance these different perspectives?"
Thanks, Niamh. Catherine, I'm going to come to you now because Eliza in Deansgate said that you write beautifully about the journey from girlhood to womanhood and that tricky space between the two, which I thought was really, really interesting. Obviously, there was the Women's Prize last night, and there was a lot of talk about women's experience there. But tell me a little bit about writing, as I say, about that sort of space in between girlhood and womanhood. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I love that comment that's been used in Waterstones on some of the sort of promo for the book about mining the space between girlhood and womanhood. And most of the female narrators in Confessions are all sort of between 16 years old and like early 20s age. And I think I wanted to explore uh, sort of passivity as a bit of a feminist subject. So I think I actually had a male friend of mine read over one section once as an early draft, and his background is in screenwriting, and he said, "This is great, but I don't have a clear sense of what these characters want." And I sort of processed that and thought, God, I need to work in, what their like greatest ambitions are and how they're going to achieve that and what their desires are. But I sort of sat back with myself and kind of realized that I think when you're that age, and especially because a lot of the novel is set in Catholic Ireland, I don't think that women's agency is something that is prioritized. So I
Mm.
was looking a bit more about how when you're younger, you're absorbing stuff and you're sort of waiting for other things in your experience or other people to come into your world to almost take you out of your experience. And they're not necessarily making these big, bold, brave decisions, but their lives, the story of their lives are changed more by them absorbing what's going on around them and being kind of taken away in a different current with the river metaphor coming back. So that I think that for me, at least when I was in my early 20s, I felt like I didn't really know what I was doing, but that was maybe there was something there of being someone who doesn't really know what you're doing.
I was going to say that's probably the time in life when that's absolutely fine. I've been worried
Yeah.
people knew exactly what they wanted to do at that age.
And for my first novel as well, I think, I don't know whether the other writers had this, like, I didn't know what I was doing at all. So I think it does sort of make sense that there is a sense of uncertainty among the different characters with what on earth they're doing with their lives.
That's the quote that should be on the shelf. I didn't know what I was doing at all. There we go. Enjoy. Thank you so much, Catherine. Lisa, I'm going to come to you now. A couple of comments here, which I think are really interesting. So, Emily in Exeter said that your book will speak to those of us that struggle to communicate our true feelings to the people around us. And Katie in Gloucester said, this book made me appreciate my family and it will make you want to hug all those close to you.
Mm.
Which I think is really interesting because books that inspire immediate emotional responses or that will make you want to reach out to maybe a family member that you haven't spoken to enough is I think a really interesting response. You must have done something there. So tell me a little bit about that difficulty in communicating feelings, and maybe why sometimes reading about an entirely fictional person can be the spur to get you to express your own emotions.
I think that most of us can relate to like the complicated relationships that we have with certain family members. But men, especially in rural areas where I grew up and where I live, have a tendency to maybe struggle even more than other people, and especially older men, because you're socialized to keep certain feelings inside you and not to communicate about vulnerability and so on. So that was definitely an aspect that I had with me from the beginning when I created Bo, the main character. And as Will said or was saying, that he doesn't believe in these like separations of power, like these are the bad and these are the good people. I'm interested in the complexity, right, within people and how you can be good and bad at the same time. And when it comes to feelings, there's that division too, right? People seem to think that if you don't talk about feelings, you don't have them. And I wanted to show that through Bo that he may not talk about certain feelings with his son, for instance, but he thinks about them and he feels them. And yeah, so I wanted to show that discrepancy between what you think and feel and what you say and communicate.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. Um, Will, I'm going to come to you next. A fantastic comment from Jack in Glasgow. He said that the complex tension between personal agency and political responsibility is explored really effectively through all the characters' choices without feeling like a lecture. And I feel like this book really stuck the landing on social commentary. That's a hard thing to pull off, as I say, without it sounding like a lecture. And you were talking a little bit about it earlier, but can you tell us a little bit more about, I suppose, when you have something that you want to say about the world, but you need to express it through characters and story rather than sort of, a polemic?
Phew. I'm really glad. I'm really happy with that comment. That's so lovely. Um, yeah, I initially set out to write this book that was it was just about this love story about the central characters and their backgrounds kind of making that difficult. In the second half, it kind of goes a little bit more out into the world, and this kind of like cloistered romance that they've had is suddenly under a microscope because of the differences between them. And it brings in perspectives from the other characters. It was written, well, the idea came in some reflections I was having around dating across race, across kind of class boundaries, and especially in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so for me, there was a really clear kind of moral argument about that, or not even a moral argument, a moral fact, really.
Mm,
In interactions I'd had in my real life with people, and just kind of generally seeing like different perspectives on it, I think it is muddier than it seems. And when it comes to love, especially in relation to all of these big structural things, um, we convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing or that like everything is black and white, but actually there is all this gray area. And I think what I wanted to do with the characters is one, keep them flawed, keep them naive. The narrator is 21 at the start of the book, and so a lot of the other characters. And so I didn't have a clear political identity when I was 21 years old. But what I did have was moments in my life that informed that identity and informed my arguments and my worldview. And so the events of the novel essentially center on this character having some of these experiences, discovering his own political identity, his own racial identity, his economic and class identity. And so you go on this journey with him, and he makes flawed decisions. The other characters make flawed decisions based on their strong convictions or their naivety. And so I wanted to express how tricky and how difficult it is to form a political identity in the face of all these different factors and different temptations, and all of those inform your selfhood. and then your selfhood has to exist in relation to your politicization as well. So I'm glad I pulled that off because yeah, I was very wary of being like, this is what I think and this is what I believe and I'm right because I'm not, right? I'm like that character. All of my experiences feed into my worldview and some of those I've come away with a complicated relationship to those things.
And can I ask, because I'm interested, when you're, because writing takes so much time, and if you're writing about something which is making a comment about what's going on in the world, but of course, as time passes, more things happen, and we live in such a fast-moving world now with events that I wonder, do you worry about keeping pace with those, or do you simply focus on the specific moment that you're writing in your book in order to give it some kind of anchor?
Yeah, I think with that the sad fact of the world and of its relation to this novel is that while it was based on reflections around that particular moment in time, um, racial violence, police violence, and the violence of white supremacy is unfortunately a recurring issue. So even as I was writing, more things were happening, and so that kind of fed into the writing process.
Mm.
I think we live in a time actually of some sliding back of the sort of moral and political and social progress that we made in kind of the start of this century. And it's becoming a time that's scarier and less safe. And the conversations around race and about class and about wealth inequality, they've they kind of dipped and then came back to where I was writing actually. Like we live in a moment that's a lot more similar to the time then than it was kind of in the intervening years, which is quite strange. But yeah, I think on that it's one of those things that unfortunately stays quite relevant. And yeah, I was talking recently about the book and about its relevance now and saying that yeah, it was based in this one moment, but unfortunately there have been more and there will be more. And so I hope the book forces people to examine uh, how they would react to similar events now and what it means to like still sit within the matrix of white supremacy.
Thanks, Will. Gurnaik, you've been sitting there very patiently, having started this conversation at the very beginning of this small river. We are now approaching the end and emptying out into the sea. See, this is why I'm not a writer. I can't do these metaphors like you can. Um, but we spoke a bit about the sort of the epic sweep of your narrative and sort of bringing those strands together. But Ginny in Enfield pointed out that as well as that, there is this layer of humour in the novel which reminded them of Ned Bowman, another author. So I don't know how you feel about that, but can you tell us a little bit, I suppose, about incorporating humour into a novel, which of course is sort of, deeply serious too.
Yeah, very flattered to be reminding someone of Ned Bowman, and he's one of my favorite writers. But yeah, humor. I think for me, there's like a lot of dark stuff in the book. There's a lot of, violence and p political stuff and climate change and all these big themes. And I had this feeling that I always want to sort of keep a balance in the novel. And it's almost like a seesaw. If I've got too much sad stuff here, I need something fun and funny on the other side to sort of balance it out. It's almost like putting two magnets together that to create the charge, you need the opposites. Um, but I also think it wasn't something I sort of sat down and was like, oh, I need to add in a funny bit now. It just happened naturally, like with the kind of characters I have in the novel. Some of them are quite foolish. So it was fun. Like there's one character, for example, is like a stunt double in Bollywood. And he's just someone I had so much fun with because he's sort of, as a stunt double, sort of obsessed with how he looks and all this kind of stuff. So it was sort of a fun vehicle to use to explore sort of crazy masculinity stuff on YouTube or workout stuff. But yeah, so the humor came naturally, but it was definitely something that I felt needed to stay in the editing process. And I did like dozens and dozens of redrafts of the book. So this, if you're reading something over and over and over, it's a really good test to know if something's funny or not. And if I still found it funny after the sort of 20th redraft, then I was like, okay, it can stay in. So yeah, if you don't like the jokes in the book, then just imagine the ones that got pulled out.
It's really interesting to hear you, all of you, in fact, talking about the characters that you've created for your books because you talk about them very much as if they're real people that you know and are sometimes surprised by, I suppose, when you're writing it. And I'm always slightly suspicious when authors say, "Oh, I write it and I didn't know what was going to happen," or the character suggested something. But is there an element of that, again, when you've got that wide range of characters, where one might end up becoming more prominent in the writing than you thought of they might be at the sort of, the planning stage?
Yeah, I think some readers might have this idea of writers like deeply thinking, figuring stuff out, and then writing. But for me, it's definitely more a process of working somewhere slightly below the level of like full consciousness, if that makes sense. I sort of think of it as like the writing process is like growing my hair. Like it's coming out of my head, but I don't know, it's sort of shapeless and do you know what I mean? And then for me, the novel comes when I go to the hairdressers and get it cut and give it shape. So it's yeah, I'm not conscious of the things as they're happening. It's almost like you're playing a game as a kid and you sort of make the rules up as you go along, if that makes sense, rather than you sort of start and be like, oh, these are going to be the rules of the game. It's just finding out through play. And for me, writing is a kind of play. It's imaginative, it's fun. And yeah, if I'm not having fun, then the reader certainly won't be. So I sort of let the process lead me. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I have to say, one of my favorite things about these conversations is, despite how different all of your books are, and or even how your approach to writing might be, there are several moments in the conversation when I can see all the heads nodding. Everyone's like, "Yeah, yeah, that's very true." Um, just to finish off, you are all debut writers, and finishing a book is a huge achievement. Getting it published is a massive achievement, and I hope that you'll agree that having a book like your debuts shortlisted for a prize like this must feel like a massive achievement. But for anybody watching or listening out there who is thinking about writing or maybe in the process of writing that first thing, would you perhaps have any sort of advice or words of wisdom or warnings, whatever, however you might want to phrase it, that you would like to share? Because you've been through this process and already hopefully like great success because of something like this prize. I'll go back to my alphabetical order here. So Catherine, I'll come to you first. Do you have any words of wisdom that you'd like to share with budding writers out there?
Yeah, it's probably not anything particularly novel. I loved the hair cutting metaphor though. I thought that was great. Yeah, I think when I was writing, I found it really helpful to not look back too much. And it's something I have to remind myself to do now with my writing, that it's so tempting to just kind of go over that first chapter over and over. But actually, I think the sense of achievement you get when you have a document that is suddenly like 60,000 words long. I think that's a really helpful position to be in when you're shaping the novel. And as people have said as well, you just know the characters so much better by that stage, whereas actually you kind of can't really get the beginning right until you've done a lot of it. And another thing which I found quite helpful actually is when I sort of really didn't believe that my book would be published, and when I was still sort of thought that what I was doing was a crazy thing. I had one person who said to me, we were walking past a bookshop in Cork, and he was like, "Oh, your book will be in there one day." And at the time, I was like, "Oh no, no, no! Like that's crazy." And then he said to me, like, "No, no, no! You need to like visualize it." And I'm not really necessarily much of a what's the word where you
Manifester.
I'm not much of a manifester, but he sort of just made me do it. And I do think that, yeah, making sure you do have like a bit of that belief there probably is quite helpful.
The belief of others, definitely a very, very helpful thing to have. Yeah, when you're lacking it yourself. Gurnaik, you've already provided us with the fantastic hairdressing metaphor, but is there anything else that you'd like to share for any wannabe writers?
Yeah, I would say sort of see your first draft as a kind of like the scaffolding around the building, right? So you got to write it to get the structure up, and then you can remove it, if that makes sense. So often I would say, like when I read students' work, it's like you can just totally lose the first paragraph you wrote because you were writing your way into it. So yeah, and that sort of ties in, I guess, with a sense of not being too precious about your work. And in terms of being able to see it anew, because I know what it's like when you're so close up to something that you can't properly see it. there are ways to sort of trick yourself to see it fresh. Reading aloud really works for me. Or like even silly stuff like changing the font or writing it by hand and stuff like that.
I love that. Just change the font.
Just change the font,
Whole new
put it
book.
in a nice font.
Yeah. There was some good nodding on that idea. Niamh, I'm going to come to you next.
Sure. So I think mine is maybe like a bit more about mindset than craft. I think, like you say, Will, it is incredible that these exciting things are happening with the book, but I'm also really conscious that like you have no control over these things, and publishing is mysterious and often devastating, and with these occasional kind of glimmers of light. And I think remembering that you don't have any control over what's going to happen at the end of the road, what you do have control over is the story that you're obsessed with and that you really want to tell. Um, and so I think for debuts, like where you're feeling all this pressure to try and write something that might eventually get published or that the market might eventually like, I think that's kind of a bit of a fool's errand. I think that uh, just writing the thing that you love and like being as weird and individual as you can and digging as deep into your kind of hyper obsessions as you can, that's where the magic is going to happen. And so I think that, yeah, try and hold on to that.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Niamh. Will, I'm coming to you now.
Yeah, lovely. Some great advice so far. I will be taking that to heart as I to. I think I agree with a lot of what's said. I've got two things, but they're kind of adding, I think. I think, yeah, writing with a reader in mind is a fool's errand. I agree. I think I got stuck halfway through because my contract came about through the Murky Books Prize. So I had an idea and I had a bit of a novel, and then I was told that I was going to publish it. And at that immediate point, suddenly I was writing because I knew it was going to be out. And I thought about the readers and I thought about the potential readers of this specific imprint. And I started writing a completely different book. And I got like 20,000 words into the second half of the book, and none of them made it in. Like they're just in a folder on my laptop. So I think writing to a potential reader or to a market or to an editor, you're not going to tell the story that you want to tell. My other one is a piece of advice that a friend, Jyoti Patel, who wrote a lovely book called All the Things We Lost, she told me that the first draft is you telling yourself the story. You don't know what happens in it until you get to the end. You don't know who the characters are or what they do. You might think you do, but what happens in here is really different to what comes out on the page. So get to the end, stop rewriting that first paragraph. I wrote the first paragraph of my book about 1,000 times. It's not in the book. I wasted hours and hours and hours on that. So get to the end is the biggest thing that you will do. Pressing that final full stop is the best feeling in the world, but you can't do that if you're just rereading. So tell yourself what happens. The first draft is not going to be the one that makes it out. So just like get to know the story, and then something good will come of it.
Excellent advice. You can rewrite that first paragraph 1,000 times, but then Gurnaik's just going to make you delete it anyway. So just, don't bother.
Exactly.
Excellent. Lisa, I'm going to come to you now. What advice would you like to share?
Well, there've been so many excellent advice this far. But I think it's important to stay true to the story or the idea that you've got, and really let yourself dig deep into that. Like, don't stop, like, investigate all the way to the end, like Will was saying. And one tips that I've got when it comes to if you get stuck in your writing, I always let my characters talk to others, and that's a good way of like writing dialogue, I guess. It's a good way of getting to know your characters, and also fairly often it makes me surprised because you think that you might think you know what's going to happen, but they just talking about things, and all of a sudden the story is taken a different turn. And another important thing I think is because many of us we sit at home and write and we don't tell anyone about it, and that might be good for you, but at a certain stage you have to let other people read your work, and reread and reread, so that you can rewrite and rewrite and rewrite because that's necessary often.
Excellent. Thank you. And Lucy, you can round us off now with some pearls of wisdom. What have you got for us?
I have two pieces of advice. The first is that no one asks you to write a novel. no one's ever going to ask you to do it. It's quite a ridiculous thing to do. So no one gives you permission, and you have to just give yourself permission. If anyone listening is a writer and is waiting for someone to give them permission, I give you permission right now to write a novel. I'm asking you to write a novel. Please do it. But you really need a huge amount of self-motivation. And my second piece of advice, which hopefully helps with that, is it's got to be fun. You've got to have a good time when you're doing it because of the aforementioned years of frustration and difficulty and deleting paragraphs. You've got to enjoy the process for you, and it's got to be fun because then the reader will have fun. This was hammered home when I was talking about my novel quite early on in the process to someone, and I was talking about all the really important themes that I wanted to dig into about feminism and creation and legacy and what we leave on the earth. And I went off on my spiel, and they sort of leaned back afterwards and said, "But don't be afraid to have fun." And it was that thing of don't be afraid to have fun, just go for it. And as soon as you inject some fun into the writing and the work itself, then it flies.
Excellent. Thank all of you so much for such great advice there for anybody writers out there. Thank you for speaking so wonderfully about your books. It's been really lovely to hear about it. And I just want to say a massive thank you, not just to the booksellers who I've quoted as part of this conversation, but all of the hundreds and hundreds of booksellers who have read as part of this prize. It is their enthusiasm, not only that makes this prize possible, but of course, they are the people who are hand selling those books to customers who walk in all the time. And that kind of passion, really is worth shouting out. So big, big thanks to all of them. I'm now going to finish off by flashing each of your books past my camera so that we can make sure that all watchers and listeners have got a very clear idea of what they should be looking for. Feel free to take a bow as I mention your name. We have Confessions by Catherine Airey, Saraswati by Gurnaik Johal, Ordinary Saints by Niamh Mhaoileoin, Sunstruck by William Rayfet Hunter, When the Cranes Fly South by Lisa Ridzén, and we have The Artist by Lucy Steeds. 6 fantastic debut novels, well worth your time, and hopefully illuminated by this free-flowing river of a conversation. Thank you, all 6 of you. I wish you all the best of luck. I don't mean to sound soppy by saying it, but you are genuinely all winners already because of, having got onto this shortlist. I hope that it's a bit of a balm to know that there are booksellers out there who absolutely love your books. So well done, all of you. And the best of luck before we announce our winner in the coming weeks. Have a
Thank
lovely day.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks,
Thank
Will.
you.
Lovely to meet you guys.
Yeah. Well done, everyone.